President Trump, let's move on to Washington, is suggesting he may extend the timeline of his takeover of Washington, D.C.'s police force, a move that would need congressional approval.
We're going to be asking for extensions on that, long-term extensions, because you can't have 30 days. 30 days that's by the time you do it. We're going to have this in good shape. We're going to do this very quickly, but we're going to want extensions. I don't want to call national emergency. If I have to, I will.
Well, yeah. So Reverend Al, last hour I did showed some poll numbers from the Washington Post, a poll that they completed in May of this year, and it so reminded me of you. You know what you're saying about woke. Some of these woke people are so asleep, or what did you say? What do you always say about woke people?
Well, I say that woke people are usually asleep. There's a difference between being awakened and being woke. Woke is being defined by a certain politic. Being awakened is how you deal with reality.
Well, I want to show you the reality right now in Washington, D.C., because everybody's saying, you know, you don't believe your lying eyes. Look at the statistics. And no, we're not saying Washington's a hellscape, but what we are saying is that right now there's some real concerns. Look at these numbers from a Washington Post poll that came out just a month or two ago, and it shows that 91% of people who live in Washington, D.C., believe the problem of crime in Washington, D.C. is serious. 50% think it's extremely or very serious. Only 7% say it's not serious at all. And then I want you to look at this quote about the people who think it is the most serious problem of all. There are stark divides along lines of race and income in the poll, with black residents and lower income residents significantly more worried about crime than white residents and those with higher incomes. As they were last year, black women are among the most concerned, with 65% saying crime is a very or extremely serious issue, compared with 82% who said the same last year. Rev, I just bring this up just to say there are a lot of, I'll just say it, white progressives who you've talked about and I've talked about, who sometimes think they're trying to help certain segments of the society, and they have no idea where they are. Well, right now in Washington, D.C., black women especially are deeply concerned about crime in their city. And I think it would behoove the Democratic Party to figure out how to build a partnership with the president, with the mayor, to make Washington a more secure city for the 91% of Washington residents who are saying today that crime is a serious problem.
Well, it goes to the situation and problem that I've said to you, and you and I have discussed before, that people are talking for people they're not talking to. There is a concern among many blacks, if not most, and many residents in Washington, D.C. about crime. We have an office of National Action Network there, so I'm familiar with it. I go in and out. I talk to the people that work for NAN there, led by a woman, a black woman. But the question becomes how Trump is handling it. I think the problem is not that there's an argument about we need to deal with crime. Even though the data says it's going down, the perception and the reality is there. The question is, Donald Trump, the only convicted felon to ever sit in the White House, by the way, pardoned criminals who assaulted police, who threatened the life of the vice president, and did not reach out and try to meet with the mayor and local law enforcement and say, how do we work together to end crime? He just came in, said, I'm taking over, and then announced I'm going to other cities, all of whom have black mayors, Los Angeles, Oakland, Chicago, New York. I'm going after all these cities, not one Republican city, not one white mayor. So for people to suspect him and his motives and the way he does it is the problem. I think what leadership there should do is what Mayor Bowser said. They're willing to sit down with the administration, and anyone else should, and say, let's deal with the problem. but don't become the problem. And don't tell us on one hand you can sit January 6th and watch people beat up cops while you're sitting in the White House doing nothing, and then come back 5 years later and say, I'm taking over the city.
And Rev, as you have spoken so often about communities of color that often will welcome more public safety efforts, but also sometimes have distrust of some of the police officers who were there on the streets.
Right.
So, David Drucker, you live in Washington, but you also, of course, cover the politics of this. We, heard from President Trump yesterday, talking about, well, maybe this is going to expand beyond the borders of D.C. And we know Washington's unique. It's the capital city. The federal government has a far bigger role to play there than it does in a city like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. I think there'd be a lot more pushback there, a lot more concern of federal overreach. But it sure seems like the White House thinks they're onto something.
Well, when people are concerned about public safety, they're often willing to put politics aside and consider many options. I think the issue, Jonathan, with the president is that the way he talks about these issues makes it hard for people who are skeptical of him or disagree with him to embrace him. And then it often pushes people into the opposite corner just for its own sake. And even the president his lack of consistency can just make it difficult, right? On the one hand, we're going to end this really quickly, right? He says that over and over. On the other hand, we need an extension. This has got to go beyond 30 days. They're not going to have the votes in Congress to do this. You cannot stick policy like this in a reconciliation package. And so with a Democratic filibuster, I don't see how he gets the extension. But that aside, I think one thing is important to understand here as voters from around the country watch this. Just because people are skeptical of Trump or have reasons, and we know what the reasons are, for being wary of him or for opposing him. When you're looking at voters in the middle, along with, soft Republicans and soft Democrats who just want government to work, they often will reject a party that simply says no because they don't like who the president is. And this is not quite apples and apples here, but if you think back to 2013 when Republicans in Congress led a shutdown of the government because they were trying to defund Obamacare, Obamacare at the time, unlike today, was deeply unpopular, and President Obama's numbers weren't really all that great. They were okay. But voters rejected the idea of using a shutdown to try and defund a law that had passed Congress. And what they were saying was, look, we don't like Obamacare, and, we're not necessarily thrilled with the president, but this isn't the way to go about governing. And so as President Trump uses the levers that he does have in Washington to try and reduce crime, at least so he says, other voters are going to be watching this and saying, hey, listen, opposing him for his own sake versus saying, all right, I know he wants to reduce crime. I share that concern, but this is a better way to do it. This is actually a way to do it versus what he's doing. That's a much better message that voters across the spectrum can receive. And I think that's important for people to understand.
All right, senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, thank you very much for coming on this morning. And